Political institutions. China's political regime is best categorized as authoritarian, one in which decisions are made by political elites, those that hold political power, without much input from citizens. Leaders are recruited through their membership in the Communist Party, but personal relationships and informal ties to others are also important in deciding who controls the regime. However, this authoritarian regime has the same problem that emperors of past dynasties had: how to effectively govern the huge expanse of land and large population from one centralized place. As China has moved away from a command economy toward a market economy, this centralization has become even more problematic in recent years. As a result, a major feature of economic decision-making is now decentralization, or devolution of power to subnational governments. Local governments often defy or ignore the central government by setting their own tax rates or building projects without consulting the central government. The political framework of the People's Republic of China is designed to penetrate as many corners of the country as possible through an elaborately organized Chinese Communist Party. As in the old Soviet Union, the party personnel control government structures. Unlike the Soviet Union, however, the CCP also integrates its military into the political hierarchy. Political elites are frequently recruited from the military, and the head of the Central Military Commission is often the most powerful leader in China. The Chinese Communist Party. Despite the many changes that China has experienced in recent years, the Chinese Communist Party is still at the heart of the political system. The party bases its claim to legitimacy not on the expressed will of the people, but on representation of the historical best interests of all the people. Society is best led by an elite vanguard party with a superior understanding of the Chinese people and their needs, democratic centralism. The organization of the CCP. The Chinese Communist Party is organized hierarchically by levels: village, township, country, province, and nation. At the top of the system is a supreme leader. Deng Xiaoping's phrase was the core, who until 1976 was Chairman Mao Zedong. The title chairman was abandoned after Mao's death, and the head of the party is now called the General Secretary. The party has a separate constitution from the government's constitution of 1982, and its central bodies are the National Party Congress. This body consists of more than 2,000 delegates chosen primarily from congresses on lower levels. It only meets every 5 years, so it is obviously not important in policy making. It usually rubber stamps decisions made by the party leaders, although in recent years it has acted somewhat more independently. Its main importance remains the power to elect members of the Central Committee. The Central Committee has about 340 members, some of whom are alternates, that meet together annually for about a week. They carry on the business of the National Party Congress between sessions. Although their size and infrequent meetings limit their policy-making powers, their meetings are called plenums, and they are important in that they are gatherings of the political elites, and from their midst are chosen the Politburo and Standing Committee. Politburo Standing Committee. These most powerful political organizations are at the very top of the CCP structure. They are also chosen by the Central Committee, and their decisions dictate government policies. The Politburo has 25 members, and the Standing Committee, chosen from the Politburo members, has only 7. They meet in secret, and their membership reflects the balance of power among factions and the relative influence of different groups in policymaking. Non-communist parties. Even though China effectively has a one-party system, the CCP does allow the existence of 8 democratic parties. Each party has a special group that it draws from, such as intellectuals or businessmen. Their total membership is about 500,000, and they are tightly controlled by the CCP. They do not contest the CCP for control of the government, but they do serve an important advisory role to the party leaders. Some members even attain high government positions, but organizationally these parties serve only as loyal non-opposition. Attempts to establish independent democratic parties outside the CCP control have been squashed, with the party doling out severe prison sentences to independent-minded leaders. Elections. The PRC holds elections in order to legitimize the government and the CCP. The party controls the commissions that run elections, and it reviews draft lists of proposed candidates to weed out those it finds politically objectionable. The only direct elections are held at the local level, with voters choosing deputies to serve in the country's People's Congresses. The People's Congresses at higher levels are selected from and by the lower levels, not directly by the people. Since the 1980s, the party has allowed more than one candidate to run for county positions, and most candidates are nominated by the people. One move toward democracy has occurred at the village level, where local officials are no longer appointed from above but are chosen in direct, secret ballot elections. The political elite. Mao Zedong's place in Chinese history was sealed by the Long March of 1934 to 1936. He emerged from the ordeal as a charismatic leader who brought about great change. His compatriots that made the journey with him became known as the Old Guard, a group of friends that networked with one another for many years through guanxi, or personal connections. These personal connections are still the glue that holds Chinese politics together today. China, like the USSR, recruits its leaders through nomenklatura, a system of choosing cadres from lower levels of the party hierarchy for advancement based on their loyalty and contributions to the well-being of the party. However, Chinese leaders communicate with one another through a patron-client network called guanxi. These linkages are similar to a good old boys networks in the West, and they underscore the importance of personal career ties among individuals as they rise in bureaucratic or political structures. Besides bureaucratic and personal ties, guanxi is based on ideological differences and similarities, and as a result has been the source of factions within the party. Guanxi is also pervasive at the local level, where ordinary people link up with village leaders and lower party officials. Factionalism. Factionalism in the years before Mao's death in 1976 was demonstrated in the splits among the radicals, led by Jiang Qing and the Gang of Four, the military under Lin Biao, and the reformers under Zhou Enlai. All three men, Mao, Lin, and Zhou, are part of the Old Guard that went on the Long March in the 1930s, but by the 1976, all were dead. Deng Xiaoping emerged as a new leader of China, partly because he was able to unite the factions in a course toward economic reform. Even before Deng's death in 1997, however, factional strife was apparent within the leadership, most notably during the 1989 Tiananmen Square incident. In general, the factions split in two ways. Conservatives. Although all factions supported economic reform, conservatives worried that perhaps the power of the party and the central government was eroded too much. They were particularly concerned about any movement toward democracy and generally support crackdowns on organizations and individuals who act too independently. Their most prominent leader has been Li Peng, the former premier and chair of the National People's Congress. His retirement in 2003 left his faction with less influence than they had before. Liberals. This faction went out of power after the 1989 Tiananmen Square incident, but they were generally more accepting of political liberties and democratic movements than are the other factions. They supported economic and political reform. The two most famous leaders of this faction were Hu Yaobang, whose death started the protests in 1989, and Zhao Ziyang, the premier and general secretary who was ousted for being too sympathetic with the Tiananmen protesters. Hu Yaobang was the mentor of China's current president Hu Jintao, but during his presidency he showed little support for democratic movements. The fact that factions in Chinese politics have little connection with ideology became apparent during the presidency of Jiang Zemin, who stepped down in 2003. Although he supported major capitalist infusion into the PRC's economy and generally promoted an open-door trade policy, his faction was, and still is, based on a patron-client system with Jiang at the top. His so-called Shanghai Gong is made up of associates from his time as mayor of Shanghai. These leaders pushed for membership in the World Trade Organization and courted the U.S. to grant most favored trading status to China. Other factions that have emerged in recent years include princelings. Many of China's recent leaders come from the princeling class, an aristocracy of families with revolutionary credentials from the days of Mao Zedong. Their policy preferences are not always clear. Some have been big beneficiaries of China's economic reforms, using their political connections and Western education to build lucrative business careers. Other princelings are critical of China's stark inequality and call for return to socialist principles. Former President Hu Jintao's son, Hu Haifeng, who headed a big provider of airport scanners, is a prominent princeling, as is Xi Jinping, who took over as party chief in 2012 and as president in 2013. Another princeling is Wan Yunsong, a financier who is the son of Wen Jiabao, the former prime minister. Chinese Communist Youth League, Tuanpai. This faction is led by former President Hu Jintao, whose allies came from the CCYL, the party's nationwide organization for youth aged 14 to 28. Some analysts characterize the Tunpai faction as promoters of the concerns of the urban and rural poor, but others see few ideological commonalities among its leaders. The leadership team selected in 2012 has strong representation from the Shanghai Gang and the Princelings, with 5 of the 7 members of the Standing Committee aligned with Jiang Zemin, and the remaining 2, including Xi Jinping, aligning with Princelings. However, leaders from both groups are rapidly aging, and so it is difficult to predict how long they will be influential. It is important to note that factional lines are often unclear and constantly shifting and overlapping. They are determined by a complex array of old alliances, family connections, and pragmatic considerations. Despite President Xi Jinping's associations with the Princelings, he almost certainly will establish his own network of patronage that will not erase his old ties, but will build new ones. As leadership changes, so do factional lines, and the government's lack of transparency makes it difficult to know exactly what those changes are. The factions follow the process of feng shui, a tightening up, loosening up cycle, a waxing and waning of power of each. In some ways, the cycle is similar to the old dynastic cycle, when ruling families were challenged as they lost the mandate of heaven. Part of the dominance of economic reformers has to do with the lingering influence of Deng Xiaoping, who designated before his death in 1997 that Jiang Zemin would be the 3rd generation, after Mao and Deng, leader, and Hu Jintao would be the 4th generation leader. As the party and government changed hands in 2012 and 2013, factional alliances were clearly continuing to shift. Corruption. The combination of Guanxi and the economic boom of the past few decades have brought about rampant corruption within the Chinese economic and political system. Bribes are common, and corruption is widely regarded as a major problem. President Jiang Zemin acknowledged in 1997, "The fight against corruption is a grave political struggle, vital to the very existence of the party and the state. If corruption cannot be punished effectively, our party will lose the support and confidence of the people." In 2004, the Communist Party's Central Committee published a policy paper that warned its members that corruption and incompetence would threaten its hold on power. The anti-corruption statement bore the mark of then-President Hu Jintao, who responded to popular perception of widespread corruption among party members. Under his watch, thousands of officials were punished for corruption, although the problem continues to plague the regime. In 2007, the Chinese government was embarrassed by international publicity about tainted food, health products, and drugs that were making their way through the world market. In reaction, the head of Beijing's most powerful food and drug regulating agency was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually executed. In his confession, he acknowledged that he had accepted gifts and bribes valued at more than $850,000 from 8 drug companies that sought special favors. Because the Chinese media hardly ever report corruption cases without official approval, many speculated that this arrest was meant to be a warning from the government. In 2011, the minister responsible for building the high-speed rail network was dismissed for skimming huge amounts of money in bribes, and another top official in the Railways Ministry also stepped down amid accusations of corruption. Despite government attempts to curtail corruption, the practice of bribing government officials by both other government officials and private businessmen is so widespread that luxury goods producers have come to count on it as an increasingly important revenue source. Still, the government's response is to condemn corruption, and when asked whether such gift-giving takes place, Chinese officials offer strong denials. In early 2012, shortly before the leadership transition, a major scandal emerged that surrounded Bo Xilai, one of the top party officials in China. Mr. Bo's wife, Gu Kailao, was arrested for the murder of business partner Neil Haywood because of differences over a business deal. Mr. Bo was jailed for his role in covering up events, with charges that included bribery, corruption, and abuse of power. Ms. Gu was convicted of the murder, and Mr. Bo was found guilty of corruption, stripped of his assets, and sentenced to life imprisonment. His downfall is seen as one of the biggest political shakeups of China's ruling elite in decades. In 2012, Xi Jinping announced a new anti-corruption program, and he acknowledged the seriousness of the problem. Xi's campaign has continued, and in 2014, officials stepped up efforts to pursue those who have fled the country with illegally obtained money. In early 2015, the Chinese government released a wanted list of 100 people, many of whom were senior officials in their workplace. Chinese officials reported that hundreds of fugitives have been returned to China to face charges. However, corruption continues to be pervasive in many areas of Chinese corporate life, including both multinational and domestic companies. Interest groups. Organized interest groups and social movements are not permitted to influence the political process unless they are under party-state authority. The party-state tries to preempt the formation of independent groups by forming mass organizations in which people may express their points of view within strict limits. These mass organizations often form around occupations or social categories. For example, most factory workers belong to the All China Federation of Trade Unions, and women's interests are represented in the All China Women's Federation. In urban areas, the party maintains social control through danwei, social units usually based on a person's place of work. People have depended on the units for their jobs, income, and promotion, but also for medical care, housing, daycare centers, and recreational facilities. The danwei system was crucial to implementing the one-child policy, since workers not complying with the policy could have their pay docked and incentives withheld. With the increasing liberalization of China's economy, the role of the work unit has changed, so that by the early 21st century, the power of work unit has diminished as more private enterprises developed, including multinational corporations. For example, it is now possible for a worker to marry or divorce without first getting permission from the work unit. Despite the ever-present control of the state, in the last 25 years, China has gone from having virtually no independent groups of any kind to more than 300,000 non-governmental organizations by official count. But that understates the true number. Counting unregistered groups, some estimates place the number as high as 2 million. Still, their impact on policy-making process is not clearly felt. For example, in 2007, China's legislature passed a new labor law to protect workers, requiring employees to provide written contracts and restricting the use of temporary laborers to help give more employees long-term job security. However, the law also enhanced the power of the All China Federation of Trade Unions, a monopoly union for the Communist Party. It is an official state organization charged with overseeing workers, and it alone was given the power to collectively bargain for wages and benefits. Workers are not allowed to form independent unions. It is important to note that no legitimate organizational channel exists for farmers. As a result, Chinese farmers are more likely than are most other citizens to express their concerns to the government through petitions and protests. These organizations and the state's relationship with them reflect state corporatism, as well as the logic of Lenin's democratic centralism. Most organizations are created or at least approved by the state, and many have government officials as their leaders. In yet another demonstration of corporatism, the state only allows one organization for any given profession or activity. In cases where two groups with similar interests exist in a community, local officials will force them to merge or will disband one in favor of the other. This practice prevents competition between the associations and limits how many associations are allowed to exist, making it easier for the state to monitor and control them. Media. From 1949 until the 1980s, almost all media, television, newspapers, radio, and magazines, were state-run. Since then, some independent media have emerged, but state-run media outlets still hold the largest share of the market. The official press agency of the government, Xinhua, is huge, employing more than 10,000 people who are stationed not only in China but abroad as well. Independent newspapers depend on Xinhua for many of their stories. The People's Daily, the official newspaper of the Central Committee of the CCP, also depends on Xinhua for much of its information. Chinese Central Television, or CCTV, is the major state television broadcaster, and it broadcasts a variety of programs to more than 1 billion people. The internet is also used by many people, with internet cafes popular in most urban areas. However, all media outlets are subject to heavy censorship by the government, which has several regulatory agencies that constantly monitor for subjects that are considered taboo by the government. Despite this censorship, Chinese media has become increasingly commercialized as economic liberalization has taken place, resulting in growing competition, a wider diversity of content, and an increase in investigative reporting.